All right, so you want to dive into Temple of Elemental Evil, huh? A classic if there ever was one. And we're here to help you make this campaign truly legendary, especially since you're interested in running it in Gary Gygax's original Greyhawk setting. And to guide us, well, we've got some insights from RPG pundit Kasimir Urbanski. He's got a pretty interesting take on DMing.
Yeah, Urbanski, he definitely has some strong opinions, particularly when it comes to pre-written adventure paths. He calls them railroads. And he believes they can actually be harmful to the game.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this whole railroad idea a bit more. I know it's something that I think a lot of DMs, myself included, might be tempted to do, especially with a module as iconic as Temple of Elemental Evil. What makes it so detrimental in Urbanski's view?
Well, he argues that railroading, essentially it turns the DM into a storyteller, rigidly dictating the plot, instead of being a referee who allows the world to react organically to player choices. So in a railroad, player agency can feel like an illusion. Even if they succeed on a roll, the DM might invent reasons for their actions to have little impact on the world, just to keep the story on track.
Right, and Urbanski uses a great example to illustrate this. Imagine a player making an incredible shot to take down the main villain early on, a natural 20.
Yeah, in a railroaded game, the DM might just invent some reason why that shot doesn't work. Maybe a magical shield or a sudden change of heart from the villain, just to preserve their pre-planned plot. And this can really make players feel like their choices don't matter, which can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we apply this to Temple of Elemental Evil, I could see how a railroad approach could really diminish the sense of exploration and discovery that makes that dungeon so compelling.
Exactly. Think about the vastness of the temple. The intricate levels, the factions vying for power. If every path that the players choose ultimately leads to the same predetermined outcome, that sense of wonder and possibility is lost.
So what's the alternative to this whole railroading dilemma? Well, Urbanski advocates for a sandbox style of DMing. What exactly does that entail?
Well, in a sandbox game, the DM sets the stage, defines the rules of the world, and then steps back to act as a referee. Player choices genuinely drive the narrative, so instead of planning out a rigid story, the DM reacts to those choices, creating a dynamic and unpredictable experience.
Right, he uses the analogy of a hex map to describe this. The map represents the potential of the game world, and the players, like explorers, they get to choose where they go and what they do.
Right, and to keep things engaging and unpredictable, the DM can utilize tools like random encounter tables. These tables can be tailored to the themes and environment of the game world, and they help to generate unexpected situations, keep players on their toes.
So thinking about Temple of Elemental Evil, you could create random encounter tables that reflect, the different levels of the dungeon, the elemental cults, the types of creatures that lurk in those depths.
Exactly. You could even have tables that change based on player actions, for example. If the players make a powerful enemy, encounters with that enemy's minions might become more frequent or dangerous.
This is starting to sound less like a pre-scripted story and more like a dynamic, evolving ecosystem.
That's the essence of Sandbox game. It's about creating a world that reacts to player choices, a world that feels alive and unpredictable.
I like that. But Urbanski also warns against something called illusionism. What's that all about?
Illusionism is a subtle trap that even well-intentioned DMs can fall into. It's when you give players the illusion of choice, but ultimately, all those choices lead to the same predetermined outcome.
So it's like having a menu with a bunch of different dishes, but they all end up tasting the same.
That's a good way to put it. It can be tempting, especially with a module like Temple of Elemental Evil, which has such a rich history and lore. You might want to hit certain plot points or introduce specific characters, but if you force those elements onto the players, regardless of their choices, you're undermining the sandbox experience.
And that brings us back to Temple of Elemental Evil in Greyhawk. We wouldn't want to create a version where every path through the dungeon ultimately leads to the same pre-planned climax. That would rob players of the thrill of true exploration and discovery.
Absolutely, and that's where the art of sandbox DMing comes in. It's about finding a balance between having a vision for your game world and allowing the players to shape that world through their choices. It's about embracing the unexpected and finding creative ways to weave player actions into the narrative tapestry.
So how can our listener avoid falling into that illusionism trap, especially when dealing with a classic module like Temple of Elemental Evil?
One way to avoid illusionism, I think, is to really understand the factions and power dynamics within the temple itself. We're talking about elemental cults, warring factions all vying for control within this incredibly dangerous environment.
Right. That's a great point. So instead of meticulously planning out a specific sequence of events, you're suggesting that our listener focus on how these different factions would organically react to player actions.
Exactly. Let's say the players decide to ally themselves with, I don't know, the water cult, for example. That choice could trigger a conflict with the fire cult, which could then spiral into a whole new set of challenges and storylines.
Oh, wow. So the players' actions, they have a ripple effect throughout the dungeon, changing the landscape of power and alliances. It becomes a much more dynamic and unpredictable game.
Precisely. And those consequences, they could play out in a myriad of ways. Perhaps the water cult, emboldened by the player support, manages to seize control of a key location within the temple. Or maybe their actions inadvertently awaken some ancient slumbering evil deep within the dungeon, creating a threat for everyone involved.
Whoa. I can see how that kind of emergent gameplay would make every decision feel weighty and consequential. It transforms the campaign from a linear story into a living, breathing world.
That's the beauty of the sandbox approach, especially when applied to a setting as rich and complex as the Temple of Elemental Evil. And to help manage this level of dynamic storytelling, those random encounter tables we mentioned earlier become invaluable tools.
Okay, so how would you tailor those tables to reflect this constantly shifting power structure within the temple? Would you create multiple tables?
Absolutely. You could have tables specific to each level of the dungeon, to each elemental cult, even to certain locations or events. As factions gain or lose power, as the players make alliances or enemies, you adjust the encounter tables to reflect those changes.
So I'm starting to see how this could work. For example, if the water cult is on the rise, players might encounter more water-themed creatures, traps, or challenges. Or if the fire cult is losing ground, maybe their encounters become more desperate and dangerous.
And remember, those random encounters, they aren't just about combat. They can be opportunities for role-playing, exploration, or even just adding a bit of flavor and unpredictability to the game world.
This is really making me rethink my approach to running Temple of Elemental Evil. I can already imagine how much more engaging and unpredictable it would be if I embraced the sandbox philosophy.
And it's worth remembering that this philosophy aligns perfectly with Gary Gygax's original vision for the temple. He wanted players to feel like they were exploring a truly dangerous and unpredictable environment, a place where their choices had real consequences.
It's about capturing that old-school dungeon-crawling spirit, that sense of wonder and peril, but within a framework that allows for player agency and emergent storytelling.
I think the most important thing is to embrace the sandbox. Don't be afraid to let go of that need for absolute control. Trust your players, empower them to make meaningful choices, and you'll be amazed at the incredible stories that emerge.
I love that idea of trusting the players and letting go of control. It can be scary for a DM to relinquish that authority, but I think it's ultimately what makes a sandbox campaign so rewarding.
So as you embark on this adventure, here's something to consider. How can you use the concepts of player agency, dynamic world building, and emergent storytelling to breathe new life into this iconic dungeon?
How can you make it a truly unforgettable experience for both you and your players? That's a question worth pondering. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of tabletop role-playing.
Until next time, may your dice rolls be ever in your favor.